August 12, 1941. Smolensk, Soviet Union. Captain Viktor Petrov crouched in a shell crater west of the city, watching German tanks advance across the wheat fields, while the field telephone beside him sat silent and useless. The wire had been cut somewhere between his position and regiment headquarters, 3 kilometers back. No communication, no orders, no artillery support. His company of 147 men faced encirclement because a single strand of copper wire, no thicker than a pencil, had been severed by shrapnel, enemy action, or perhaps just the weight of retreating vehicles rolling over it for the 100th time. Petrov had sent 2 runners. Neither returned. The German advance continued. At 14:23 hours, he ordered retreat without authorization, without coordination, without knowing if adjacent units were holding or falling back. His company survived. 3 neighboring companies did not, caught in a pincer movement that proper communications might have prevented. This scene repeated across the Eastern Front during the first months of Operation Barbarossa. The Red Army entered the war with approximately 50,000 field telephones and 2 million kilometers of field wire. Within 90 days, Soviet forces had lost or abandoned an estimated 35,000 telephones and 1.4 million kilometers of wire. German mechanized columns moved faster than Soviet signals troops could lay new lines. Retreating units cut their own wire to deny it to the enemy, creating permanent communication voids. The few wires that remained intact faced a different problem. Soviet military field wire, designated P5, consisted of steel core with minimal copper plating and rubber insulation that cracked in temperatures below -20 degrees Celsius. The wire had been adequate for peacetime exercises. Under combat conditions across a front stretching 2,900 kilometers, it failed systematically. German forces operated with significant communications advantage. Their Feldfernsprecher 33, the standard Wehrmacht field telephone, connected via robust cable that German industry had been producing since rearmament began in the mid-1930s. German field wire used higher copper content, superior insulation, and came in standardized drums of 500 meters that 2 men could carry and deploy rapidly. More critically, German doctrine emphasized communications. Each Wehrmacht division included signals battalions with dedicated wire-laying vehicles, repair sections, and reserve stocks sufficient for extended operations. The Blitzkrieg succeeded not just through tanks and aircraft, but through the ability to coordinate those assets via functioning telephone networks that connected every level of command from battalion to army group. Soviet communication failures produced measurable military catastrophe. At Kiev in September 1941, the encirclement and destruction of 4 Soviet armies resulted partly from communication breakdown. Southwestern Front headquarters lost contact with forward divisions for periods exceeding 18 hours. Orders arrived late or not at all. Artillery support remained uncoordinated. Soviet forces that might have executed organized withdrawal instead disintegrated into scattered units moving independently, making encirclement inevitable. The Germans captured 665,000 Soviet soldiers at Kiev. Post-battle Soviet analysis identified communications failure as a primary contributing factor. Similar patterns emerged at Vyazma and Bryansk in October, where another 673,000 Soviet soldiers were captured after communication networks collapsed under German pressure. The technical specifications revealed the depth of Soviet disadvantage. Soviet P5 wire had a breaking strength of approximately 15 kilograms. German field wire could withstand 40 kilograms before snapping. Soviet wire insulation degraded after exposure to moisture, sunlight, or freezing temperatures. German insulation remained functional across temperature ranges from -40 to +60 degrees Celsius. Soviet field telephones, the TA-43 model, had an effective range of 8 kilometers under ideal conditions. German FF-33 telephones reliably transmitted across 20 kilometers. These differences compounded across an army of millions. Soviet signals officers calculated that field wire lasted an average of 9 days before requiring replacement under combat conditions. Soviet domestic production in 1941 reached approximately 800,000 kilometers of field wire monthly. Frontline consumption exceeded 1.2 million kilometers monthly. The mathematics were unsustainable. By September 1941, Soviet representatives in Washington had begun compiling requests for American aid. The lists included tanks, aircraft, trucks, food, fuel, raw materials, and buried within the documentation, a request that received little attention but would prove as essential as any weapons system: telephone wire. The initial Soviet request specified 5 million meters of field telephone wire, meeting specific technical requirements. American officials reviewing the request noted the quantity with interest. 5 million meters would stretch from Moscow to Vladivostok. The Soviets were requesting enough wire to rebuild their entire military communications network. What they would actually receive would exceed even that extraordinary figure by margins that would reshape the Eastern Front and reveal American industrial capacity in its most unglamorous but essential form. The wire war was about to begin, fought not with bullets but with copper, not through destruction but through connection, not by severing enemy communications but by creating Soviet networks from American abundance measured in millions of miles of thread-thin metal that would carry Russian voices coordinating German defeat. October 1941. Washington, D.C. The Soviet Purchasing Commission submitted formal requisitions to the U.S. War Department for communications equipment under the recently enacted Lend-Lease program. The request documented Soviet requirements with precision born of desperation: 10 million meters of field telephone wire initially, with ongoing monthly deliveries of 2 million meters thereafter. The wire specifications were exacting. Gauge, 18 AWG, American Wire Gauge Standard. Insulation, weatherproof rubber compound rated for temperatures ranging from -40 to +50 degrees Celsius. Tensile strength, minimum 35 kilograms breaking point. Copper content, 99.9% pure. The Soviets were not requesting equivalent to their own wire. They were requesting wire superior to anything in their inventory, wire that matched or exceeded German military standards. American response came with industrial speed that would have seemed impossible to Soviet planners accustomed to 5-year plans and chronic production shortfalls. Western Electric, the manufacturing arm of the Bell telephone system, received contracts in November 1941. The company operated 23 factories across the United States, producing telephone equipment for civilian and military markets. Western Electric's Kearney, New Jersey plant alone employed 42,000 workers and could produce 50,000 field telephones monthly at full capacity. The Hawthorne Works in Illinois, covering 200 acres with 6 million square feet of factory space, manufactured cable and wire at rates exceeding 1 million meters daily when operating 3 shifts. These facilities, built to connect American homes and businesses, would now connect Soviet armies. Production began in December 1941. Western Electric converted civilian telephone wire production lines to military specifications. The wire emerged from extrusion machines in continuous lengths, copper core drawn to precise diameter, wrapped in insulation compounded from natural rubber, sulfur, and chemical stabilizers that prevented cracking in extreme temperatures. The wire was wound onto wooden drums, each containing 500 meters, the same standardization the Germans used. Each drum weighed 18 kilograms fully loaded, light enough for 2 soldiers to carry, robust enough to survive shipping across oceans and continents. By January 1942, Western Electric factories were producing 3 million meters of military field wire weekly, with production capacity still expanding. The scale dwarfed Soviet capabilities. Soviet wire production in early 1942, after evacuation of Western factories to the Urals, reached approximately 600,000 meters monthly. American factories contracted for Soviet Lend-Lease were producing that quantity every 2 days. The price per meter reflected American industrial efficiency. 8 cents per meter for high-grade military field wire, a figure that included copper, insulation, manufacturing, and profit margin. The initial contract value for 10 million meters totaled $800,000, less than the cost of a single B-17 bomber. The Soviets were receiving their entire military communications network backbone for the price of 4-engine aircraft America was producing at rates exceeding 100 monthly. Shipping presented challenges that tested American logistics as thoroughly as production tested American industry. The primary route ran through Arctic waters to Murmansk and Arkhangelsk. Convoy PQ-8 departed Iceland on January 8, 1942, carrying among its cargo 847 drums of telephone wire, representing 423,500 meters. The convoy fought through storms, ice, and German air attacks. 2 ships were lost. The wire reached Murmansk. Convoy PQ-12 in March delivered 1,200 drums. Convoy PQ-13 delivered 980 drums despite losing 5 ships to U-boats and Luftwaffe bombers. The Arctic route, operational only during certain months, delivered approximately 40% of American aid to the Soviet Union during 1942. The Persian corridor provided an alternative that would eventually surpass Arctic convoys in total tonnage. American ships unloaded cargo at Persian Gulf ports, primarily Bandar Shapur and Khorramshahr. From there, supplies moved by rail through Iran into Soviet Azerbaijan. The route covered 1,600 kilometers and required upgrading Iranian railways to handle the volume. American engineers widened tracks, built sidings, established depots. By spring 1942, the Persian route was moving 30,000 tons monthly, including substantial quantities of communications wire. Each railcar carried approximately 200 drums, 100,000 meters of wire, enough to connect regimental headquarters across 30 kilometers of front. The Pacific route through Vladivostok handled cargo Japanese neutrality with the Soviet Union permitted, primarily non-military supplies officially, though American telephone wire arrived in quantities suggesting flexible interpretation of agreements. Ships departing West Coast ports carried drums of wire stacked in holds alongside trucks, tires, industrial machinery, and food. The voyage took 11 days in good weather. Vladivostok docks received approximately 250,000 meters of American telephone wire monthly through 1942 via this route. By March 1942, cumulative American deliveries exceeded 8 million meters. Soviet signals depots from Murmansk to Moscow received wooden drums stenciled with Western electric markings and English-language handling instructions. Soviet signals officers who opened the first drums discovered wire that exceeded specifications. The insulation was thicker, more flexible. The copper gleamed with purity their own wire never achieved. Field tests demonstrated the American wire could be buried, exposed to weather, driven over by vehicles, and remain functional. The breaking strength exceeded Soviet wire by factors of 2 to 3. Soviet soldiers who had been splicing broken P5 wire daily discovered American wire that lasted weeks without failure under identical conditions. Spring 1942 brought mud, German offensives, and American telephone wire arriving at Soviet depots faster than signals units could string it across the reorganizing front lines. The education in American abundance was beginning, measured in millions of meters of copper thread that would carry Russian voices toward German defeat. October 1942, Stalingrad. Senior Sergeant Mikhail Volkov unpacked wooden drums of American telephone wire in a bombed factory basement that served as the 62nd Army Signals Depot. The drums had arrived via Astrakhan after traveling from Murmansk through Moscow and down the Volga. Each drum bore Western electric markings and weighed exactly 18 kilograms. Volkov had been laying telephone wire since the war began. He knew Soviet P5 wire intimately, knew how it snapped in cold weather, how the insulation cracked after a week exposed to sun, how it failed when you needed it most. He unwound a length of American wire and tested it between his hands. The insulation felt different, thicker, more supple. He bent it sharply. No cracking. He pulled hard. The wire stretched slightly but held. Volkov had orders to string 4 kilometers of wire connecting division headquarters in the Red October factory to forward positions at the Barricadi gunworks. He chose American wire. Stalingrad's urban combat created communication requirements unlike anything Soviet forces had previously encountered. Buildings collapsed hourly from artillery and airstrikes, severing wires strung through ruins. German positions sat 50 meters from Soviet positions in some sectors, close enough that wire had to be buried or concealed to prevent cutting. The city's rubble-choked streets made vehicle movement impossible, requiring signals troops to carry wire drums on their backs while crawling through destroyed buildings under sniper fire. Soviet 62nd Army signals units were laying an average of 8 kilometers of new wire daily during October and November 1942, just to maintain existing communications as combat destroyed lines faster than they could be repaired. Volkov's team strung the American wire on October 18th. They worked at night, 4 men carrying drums, moving through basements and sewers, emerging only to cross streets under covering fire. The wire ran from the factory cellar through 2 kilometers of ruins to forward trenches. German mortars hit twice during installation. Shrapnel cut Soviet P5 wire regularly. The American wire, when hit by shrapnel, showed damage, but rarely severed completely. Its higher tensile strength and thicker insulation absorbed impacts that would have cut Soviet wire clean through. By dawn, the connection was functional. Division headquarters could speak directly to forward companies for the first time in 6 days. Field testing under Stalingrad conditions provided brutal but definitive comparison of wire performance. Soviet P5 wire laid in identical conditions alongside American wire failed after an average of 6 days. The insulation cracked in the rubble, allowing moisture to corrode the steel core. The thin gauge snapped when rubble shifted or soldiers stepped on it. American wire in the same locations remained functional for an average of 28 days. Soviet signals officers documented this in reports forwarded to Moscow. The American wire was not marginally better. It was fundamentally superior in every measurable way. The technical specifications explained the performance gap. Soviet P5 wire used steel core with copper plating approximately 0.3 millimeters thick. American wire used solid copper core 1.02 millimeters in diameter. The conductivity difference meant American wire could carry signals across greater distances with less degradation. Soviet wire was rated for 8 kilometers maximum range. American wire functioned reliably across 15 kilometers under field conditions. The insulation composition made the critical difference. Soviet rubber insulation contained high sulfur content that made it rigid in cold temperatures. American insulation used compound rubber with plasticizers that maintained flexibility down to -40 degrees Celsius. When temperatures dropped in November, Soviet wire became brittle while American wire remained supple. Casualty statistics revealed communication wire as life-saving equipment. Soviet signals troops suffered horrific losses at Stalingrad, with mortality rates approaching 40% among wire-laying teams. These soldiers had to expose themselves to lay and repair lines constantly. Wire that lasted 4 times longer meant 4 times fewer repairs, 4 times fewer exposures to enemy fire. Units using American wire exclusively reported signals casualty rates 60% lower than units relying on Soviet wire. The connection between wire quality and soldier survival was direct and measurable. By December 1942, American wire had become the standard for critical communications throughout 62nd Army. Every connection from Army headquarters to division headquarters used American wire exclusively. Frontline units received American wire as priority allocation, with Soviet wire relegated to secondary or temporary installations. The Wehrmacht's November offensive failed, partly because Soviet defensive coordination functioned despite the intensity of German attacks. Artillery fire missions received and executed within minutes. Reinforcements moved to threatened sectors based on accurate real-time information. Counterattacks launched with precise timing across multiple positions simultaneously. All of this required functioning communications that American wire provided. Soviet war production statistics from 1942 revealed the scale of dependence developing. American Lend-Lease deliveries of telephone wire through December totaled 42 million meters. Soviet domestic production same period totaled 9 million meters. American wire constituted 82% of all new field wire available to Soviet forces during the second half of 1942. At Stalingrad specifically, an estimated 95% of all telephone wire connecting Soviet positions was American-manufactured. The city that broke the Wehrmacht was connected by copper wire, spun in New Jersey factories and shipped across Arctic seas. Every order that coordinated the encirclement of German 6th Army traveled along American wire. Every artillery strike that destroyed German positions was called in via American connections. The voices were Russian. The wire whispered, American. Spring 1943. Kursk salient. Lieutenant Colonel Andrei Sokolov conducted inventory at Central Front Signals Depot and counted equipment that had not existed in Soviet arsenals 2 years earlier. The wooden crates bore English stenciling and shipping marks from ports he had never heard of. Baltimore, Philadelphia, San Francisco. Inside the crates sat American field telephones, model EE-8B, manufactured by Western Electric. Each telephone weighed 2.4 kilograms in its canvas carrying case, half the weight of the Soviet TA-43. Sokolov opened one case and examined the device. Black bakelite housing, handset with braided cord, generator crank on the side for signaling, binding posts for wire connection. The construction quality exceeded anything Soviet factories produced. The components fit precisely with no rattling or loose parts. The instruction manual, translated into Russian by Lend-Lease administration, explained operation in clear diagrams that required minimal text. American telephone deliveries had accelerated through 1943 as production lines reached full capacity. Western Electric shipped 47,000 EE-8B field telephones to the Soviet Union during the first 6 months of 1943. Each telephone cost the US government $18.50 to manufacture, including all components, assembly, testing, and packaging. Soviet production of the TA-43 telephone during the same period totaled 12,000 units at a manufacturing cost estimated at 340 rubles each, approximately $68 at official exchange rates. American mass production achieved costs 1/4 of Soviet production, while delivering superior equipment in quantities 4 times greater. The mathematics of industrial democracy were being written in bakelite and copper wire. The EE-8B outperformed Soviet equipment across every technical specification. Range under field conditions, 27 kilometers with American wire, compared to 8 kilometers for the TA-43 with Soviet wire. Weather resistance. The American telephone functioned in temperatures from -40 to +50 degrees Celsius without modification. The TA-43 required special winterization procedures below -20 degrees. Durability. Drop testing showed the EE-8B remained functional after falls from 2 meters onto concrete. The TA-43 housing cracked under similar impact. Most significantly, the EE-8B required minimal maintenance. Soviet signals officers reported American telephones functioning continuously for 6 months without repair under combat conditions. Soviet telephones required maintenance every 3 weeks on average. Switchboards arrived in quantities that transformed Soviet communications from simple point-to-point connections to actual networks. The American BD-71 switchboard, portable model weighing 16 kilograms, could handle 12 lines simultaneously. Soviet forces had entered the war with inadequate switchboard capacity, forcing commanders to communicate through relay systems that delayed messages and introduced errors. American switchboards delivered through Lend-Lease numbered 8,300 units by mid-1943, creating network capacity that had not existed previously. A single rifle division, equipped with American switchboards and telephones, could establish communications net connecting regiment headquarters to all 9 rifle battalion commanders simultaneously, with capacity remaining for artillery liaison and supporting units. Training programs at Soviet signal schools incorporated American equipment as standard curriculum by 1943. New signals officers learned the EE-8B before the TA-43. Instruction emphasized the American equipment's reliability and the tactical advantages it provided. The standardization carried strategic benefit that Soviet planners had not initially anticipated. American equipment used interchangeable parts, a damaged EE-8B could be repaired using components from another EE-8B. Soviet equipment lacked this standardization even within the same model year due to production variations across different factories. American spare parts arrived in systematic packaging with clear documentation. Each signals depot received maintenance kits containing the most commonly needed components: handsets, cords, generator assemblies, binding posts. Soviet equipment repair required cannibalization of other units or lengthy requisitions to specific factories. The Germans noticed. Intelligence reports from captured Soviet positions documented the prevalence of American equipment. Wehrmacht signals officers examining captured Soviet communications gear in early 1943 expressed surprise at the quality and quantity of American telephones and switchboards. Some German units began preferring captured American equipment over their own standard-issue FF-33 telephones. The American EE-8B was lighter, had better range, and proved more reliable than the German field telephone, a device that had been considered superior to all Allied equipment at the war's beginning. The shift in technical advantage was measurable and undeniable. Operation Citadel, the German offensive at Kursk beginning July 5, 1943, tested Soviet communications infrastructure against the largest coordinated attack the Wehrmacht would ever launch on the Eastern Front. Soviet defensive preparations included establishing communications networks of unprecedented density. Central Front and Voronezh Front, deployed along a 550-kilometer arc, contained more than 12,000 kilometers of telephone wire, 80% of it American. Every strongpoint connected to company headquarters, every company to battalion, every battalion to regiment, every regiment to division, every division to army, every army to front headquarters. The network used 6,200 American field telephones and 340 American switchboards. When German armor attacked, Soviet artillery responded with coordination that had been impossible in 1941. Forward observers called fire missions directly to artillery battalions. Commands from front headquarters reached division commanders within minutes. Reserves moved to threatened sectors based on accurate real-time information flowing through copper wire networks that functioned despite the most intense bombardment the Red Army had yet endured. American equipment deliveries for 1943 totaled 156,000 field telephones, 12,400 switchboards, and 87 million meters of wire. Soviet production same period: 31,000 telephones, 800 switchboards, 14 million meters of wire. By year's end, American communications equipment constituted 83% of all field telephones in Soviet service, 94% of switchboards, and 86% of field wire. The Red Army was speaking Russian through American devices, coordinating operations across thousands of kilometers using equipment manufactured in New Jersey, Illinois, and Massachusetts. The voices commanding Soviet victory carried through circuits designed in American laboratories and mass-produced with American efficiency that Soviet industry could observe but not replicate. September 1944. East Prussia. German military intelligence officer Major Heinrich Krebs examined captured Soviet communications equipment at Army Group Center headquarters. The haul from a recent engagement included 12 field telephones, 2 switchboards, and approximately 400 meters of field wire. Krebs had expected Soviet TA-43 telephones and P5 wire, equipment German intelligence had catalogued extensively since 1941. Instead, he found American EE-8B telephones with English markings and manufacturing dates from 1943. The switchboards bore Western Electric labels. The wire specifications matched American military standards precisely. Krebs compiled a report noting that in recent months, German forces were capturing almost exclusively American communications equipment from Soviet positions. His conclusion troubled headquarters. The Soviets were no longer operating with inferior equipment supplemented by modest American aid, but rather with comprehensive American communication systems that exceeded German capabilities in quantity and possibly quality. Wehrmacht communications had degraded systematically since 1943 as German industrial capacity struggled under Allied bombing and resource shortages. Copper production, essential for wire manufacturing, declined from 340,000 tons in 1942 to 180,000 tons in 1944. German signals units received replacement wire in quantities insufficient to maintain existing networks. Captured Soviet equipment reports from late 1944 documented a reversal. Soviet forces were advancing with abundant communications equipment, while German forces improvised with aging gear and inadequate supplies. The American industrial base was now supplying Soviet communications more effectively than German industry supplied its own forces. Cumulative Lend-Lease deliveries through 1944 revealed totals that dwarfed the initial Soviet requests. Total field telephone wire delivered 956,000 kilometers, enough to circle Earth 23 times. Total field telephones delivered 247,000 units. Total switchboards delivered 17,500 units. The dollar value of communications equipment alone exceeded $35 million, equivalent to approximately 200 Sherman tanks. Soviet domestic production over the same period totaled 144,000 kilometers of wire, 68,000 telephones, and 2,100 switchboards. American equipment constituted 87% of all communications gear available to Soviet forces by late 1944. The Vistula-Oder offensive beginning January 12, 1945, demonstrated Soviet communications capability at its operational peak. Marshal Zhukov's First Belarusian Front attacked from the Vistula River toward Berlin across a front of 400 kilometers. The offensive involved 2.2 million Soviet soldiers, 6,500 tanks, and 46,000 artillery pieces. Coordinating this mass required communications infrastructure that had not existed in 1941. Soviet signals units had laid 127,000 kilometers of telephone wire in the months preceding the offensive, 94% of it American manufactured. Every tank army headquarters connected via multiple redundant lines to front headquarters. Artillery divisions maintained direct connections to forward observation posts. The offensive advanced 600 kilometers in 23 days, the fastest sustained advance of the war. German defenders, equipped with degraded communications and limited wire stocks, could not coordinate an effective response to Soviet thrusts that exploited gaps within hours of their appearance. Berlin presented the final test. The assault on the German capital, beginning April 16, 1945, required communications density exceeding any previous operation. Soviet forces laid 189,000 kilometers of telephone wire for the Berlin operation, connecting 2.5 million soldiers across 3 fronts. American EE-8B telephones numbered more than 15,000 in the Berlin assault forces alone. Every regimental commander could speak directly to battalion commanders, every battalion commander to company commanders. Soviet artillery, the decisive arm at Berlin, coordinated fire through communications networks that functioned despite the intensity of urban combat. Buildings collapsed on wire runs constantly. Soviet signals troops relayed connections using abundant American wire stocks that permitted immediate replacement of damaged lines. German communications in Berlin, by contrast, relied increasingly on radio as wire stocks approached exhaustion. Radio communications proved vulnerable to jamming and interception. Soviet wire networks, though primitive compared to radio, provided secure, reliable connections that American copper made possible. Post-war Soviet accounting acknowledged the scale of American communications aid, though official histories minimized its importance. Lend-Lease final statistics documented total deliveries of 2.1 million kilometers of telephone wire, 380,000 field telephones, and 23,000 switchboards to the Soviet Union between 1941 and 1945. The tonnage of communications equipment exceeded 86,000 metric tons, requiring more than 3,000 cargo ship voyages to transport. Soviet industry would have required an estimated 12 years to produce equivalent quantities at wartime production rates. The time compression was the crucial factor. American industry delivered in 4 years what would have taken Soviet industry more than a decade, providing equipment exactly when Soviet forces needed it to coordinate offensives that destroyed German armies. Cost comparisons revealed American industrial efficiency at scales that challenged Soviet economic assumptions. American production cost for field wire, 8 cents per meter. Soviet production cost, approximately 31 cents per meter equivalent. American field telephone production cost, $18.50 per unit. Soviet equivalent, $68 per unit. American mass production achieved costs 1/4 of Soviet costs, while delivering quality substantially higher. The mathematical demonstration of capitalist efficiency was irrefutable and deeply uncomfortable for Soviet ideology. Victory had been achieved with American copper connecting Soviet command posts, American bakelite carrying Russian voices, American industrial democracy enabling communist military triumph. The wire that carried orders to storm the Reichstag had been manufactured in factories the Soviet system theoretically opposed but practically required. May 9, 1945. Berlin. Senior Sergeant Viktor Petrov, the same signals officer who had crouched in a crater at Smolensk in August 1941, watching his field telephone sit useless, now stood in the ruins of the Reichstag, connecting communication lines for occupation forces. The wire he strung was American, from drums marked Western Electric, manufactured in New Jersey in February 1945. Petrov had survived 4 years of war laying telephone wire from Moscow to Berlin. He had used Soviet P5 wire that snapped in his hands and American wire that never failed. He knew which wire had made the difference. Every critical communication during the final assault on Berlin had traveled through American copper. Every coordination between rifle divisions advancing through the city, every artillery fire mission that reduced German strongpoints, every order from Marshal Zhukov's headquarters had moved along wire manufactured 8,000 kilometers away by workers who would never see the victory their product enabled. Lend-Lease termination came with shocking abruptness. President Truman signed the order on May 12, 1945, 3 days after German surrender. American supply shipments to the Soviet Union ceased immediately. Convoys at sea turned back. Contracts with Western Electric and other suppliers were cancelled. The pipeline that had delivered 2.1 million kilometers of wire over 4 years went dry within a week. Soviet signals depots that had grown accustomed to regular American shipments suddenly faced the reality of dependence. Requests for continued deliveries went unanswered. The Soviet Union, which had built its communications infrastructure on American abundance, now confronted the task of maintaining that infrastructure through domestic production alone. Soviet industry scrambled to replace American supplies. Production quotas for telephone wire increased to 4 million meters monthly by late 1945, 5 times wartime production rates. The wire quality remained inferior to American standards. Soviet field telephones, redesigned using captured German equipment and reverse-engineered American components, entered production in 1946. Manufacturing costs remained 3 times higher than American production costs, while quality lagged. Soviet switchboard production never matched the capacity American Lend-Lease had provided. By 1948, Soviet signals units were still using American EE-8B telephones and switchboards from wartime deliveries because domestic replacements proved inadequate or unavailable. Lend-Lease debt negotiations began in 1946 and continued for decades. The United States claimed $11.3 billion in Lend-Lease aid to the Soviet Union, approximately $180 billion in modern values. The Soviets acknowledged receiving aid, but disputed the accounting and the obligation to repay. Communications equipment represented a tiny fraction of total aid, less than 0.5% by dollar value, yet its impact had been disproportionate. Soviet negotiators never publicly acknowledged that American wire and telephones had been essential to victory. Official Soviet histories emphasized heroism and sacrifice while minimizing material aid. The wire that connected every Soviet command post from Stalingrad to Berlin disappeared from the narrative, too inglorious to mention, too essential to explain away. Historical debate continues regarding whether Soviet victory required American aid. Soviet industrial production after 1942 exceeded German production in most categories. Soviet manpower reserves dwarfed German reserves. Soviet strategic position improved continuously after Stalingrad regardless of aid. But communications equipment represented a category where Soviet industry demonstrably could not meet military requirements without American production. The statistics are unambiguous. American communications equipment constituted 87% of Soviet field telephones, 94% of switchboards, and 86% of field wire by 1945. Soviet military coordination, the ability to mass force at decisive points and coordinate complex operations across thousands of kilometers, depended fundamentally on American industrial capacity translated into copper wire and bakelite telephones. The ideological paradox remained unresolved. Capitalist production had enabled communist victory. American industrial democracy had achieved what Soviet planned economy could not: mass production of reliable equipment in quantities sufficient to supply both American forces and Soviet forces simultaneously. American factories in 1943 produced enough communications equipment to supply a military of 12 million American personnel, plus provide 87% of Soviet requirements. German industry under total war mobilization could barely supply its own forces. The comparison revealed truths about economic systems that Soviet ideology found impossible to acknowledge. Abundance came from methods the Soviet system rejected. Efficiency came from competition the Soviet system eliminated. Quality came from standards the Soviet system could observe but not replicate. Cold War irony compounded the paradox. American telephone wire laid during World War II remained in Soviet use for decades, connecting military installations that were now aimed against America. Warsaw Pact communication systems incorporated American Lend-Lease equipment throughout the 1950s. Soviet signals officers trained on American EE-8B telephones, learning their reliability and cursing Soviet replacements that failed constantly. East German forces operated captured Wehrmacht equipment supplemented by Soviet copies of American designs. The communications networks that would have coordinated Warsaw Pact operations against NATO were partially built from American copper wire delivered under Lend-Lease 20 years earlier. Museums in Russia today display American communications equipment with minimal explanation. The Central Armed Forces Museum in Moscow has Western electric field telephones in storage, rarely exhibited. When shown, the labels identify them as Allied aid, without elaboration. Veterans who survived the war remembered American wire with clarity that official histories never matched. Signals troops interviewed in the 1980s and 1990s consistently identified American equipment as superior and essential. One veteran stated simply, "We spoke Russian, but American wire carried our words. Without it, we would have been deaf and mute." The nature of alliance revealed itself in copper and bakelite as clearly as in tanks and aircraft. Wars are won with unglamorous supplies as much as with weapons. Communications matter as much as firepower. Coordination determines victory as much as courage. American industrial capacity demonstrated its ultimate advantage not through destruction delivered, but through connection enabled. The abundance was so vast it could be shared with allies while still supplying American forces worldwide. German industry could not supply its own military adequately. American industry supplied two militaries simultaneously, including a former adversary that would become a future adversary because productive capacity existed to do so without strain. Millions of kilometers of American copper wire remain buried in Russian and European soil, connecting nothing now, corroding slowly, forgotten by history. But in 1941 through 1945, that wire connected Soviet command posts to victory, carried Russian voices coordinating German defeat, demonstrated democratic abundance through the most prosaic of products. The wire spoke American even when transmitting Russian. Every order that moved Soviet forces forward traveled through circuits designed in American laboratories and manufactured with American efficiency. The Germans heard silence as their communications failed. The Soviets heard coordination as American wire connected every command post from Moscow to Berlin. Democracy produced abundance. Abundance produced victory. The copper wire whispered the truth in English, though the orders it carried were Russian. This is what industrial democracy achieves. This is what freedom manufactures. The Soviet command posts coordinating final victory stood connected by thread-thin American copper spun in New Jersey factories, shipped across Arctic seas, strung by Russian hands, carrying voices that spoke of triumph, enabled by the quiet, essential, unglamorous abundance that only democracy produces, at scale sufficient to give away to allies while defeating enemies simultaneously. The wire won the war.